She's still wearing her bridal dress, but instead of becoming a bride, she's taken into a house like she doesn't belong there. They don't call her a bride, they make her clean the barn, force her to chop wood in the freezing cold. Her mother-in-law steals everything she has, and her husband, he doesn't say a single word. That night, Kater realizes the truth. The place she thought would protect her has become her prison. But what no one knows is this beat. The girl who suffers in silence, the one who endures everything without a word. One day, her patience will open a door so powerful that no one in that house will ever be the same again, because the last traces of joy still hanging over the village's mud brick houses lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of henna on Kater's hands. The drums had fallen silent, and the celebratory cries had faded into a deep, heavy night. As Kater lay her head on the pillow, dreaming of the wedding feast that would be set the next day and the pure white dress she would wear, she couldn't quiet the flutter in her chest. She was only 19. Her mother had passed away long ago, and her father, Sefer, had raised her with great care, guarding her like something precious. "You are my trust, my daughter," he would always say. "Where you go will be your home, and Cihan will be your shelter." But that night, a cold wind came whistling down from the peak of Mount Hassan, carrying something ominous into the village. Just before dawn, when the door was shaken by desperate knocking, Kater's heart lurched. The news that came wasn't meant for a wedding morning. It belonged to mourning. Her father, Sefer, had passed away in his sleep, at the very dawn of the day he was supposed to see his daughter become a bride. The whole village fell into grief. When Kater collapsed over her father's lifeless body, her freshly hennaed hands trembling against him, it felt as if her world had shattered. The wedding dress was left abandoned in a corner. The red veil had turned black with sorrow. And in that moment, everything began to change, with the arrival of her mother-in-law, Hatis. Hatis was the wealthiest and most influential woman in the village, but her heart was just as hardened. She kept her son, Cihan, close under her control, and the bride she would bring into her home was never meant to be a partner, only someone who would serve. The funeral passed, and the fresh soil was laid over fresh pain. Even before leaving the graveside, Hatis took hold of Cihan's arm. Her voice was low and cold. "Listen, son," she whispered. "She brought misfortune before she even stepped into our house. She buried her father, put out his fire. If we leave her like this now, what will people say? They'll say we abandoned her. No wedding now. We'll take her in quietly tonight, after dark. The marriage can wait. Let the mourning pass first. Let whatever bad luck she carries fade." Cihan swallowed, looking at Kater's broken state. "Mother, how can we do this without a marriage? Isn't that wrong?" Hatis's gaze sharpened instantly. "What's wrong is going against your mother," she said. "What I say is final. Her father is gone. She has no one now. Even taking her into this house is a favor. Marriage? That's just paper. First, we'll see if she brings blessing, or if she learns her place and works." That night, when Kater's home stood empty without her father, Hatis and Cihan came to her door. Kater's eyes were swollen from crying. She was still wearing the heavy embroidered dress from the night before. Hatis stepped inside without even offering a single word of condolence and grabbed her by the arm. "Come on," she said. "You'll have time to mourn later. Your home is with us now. Gather your things. Cihan is waiting outside." Kater looked at Cihan, lost and defenseless. He stood there with his head lowered, like a man hiding behind his mother's shadow. She remembered her father's words. Your husband will be your shelter. She didn't know that the shelter she believed in would become her prison. Kader was taken out of her own home like a stranger. The moment they stepped into Hatis's house, the older woman shut the door hard behind them and locked it. As Kader moved toward a room, Hatis's sharp voice cut through from the kitchen. Where do you think you're going? That room belongs to Tihan. You're not married yet. You're not the bride of this house. Take off that dress and put this on. She threw an old cardigan toward her. Your bed is in the storage room behind the kitchen. You'll be up at dawn to light the oven. Don't think you can sit around just because your father died. This isn't a mansion. It's a house where you work. Kader froze. Her henna'd hands trembled. She looked at Shihan, waiting for a word, a sign, anything, protection, acknowledgement. But when his mother said, "Go on, son, get some rest. Tomorrow we'll be busy," Shihan turned his back and walked upstairs. That first night, while her father's grave was still fresh, Kader curled up in the freezing storage room beside a sack of wheat, pulling her knees to her chest, waiting for morning. Her dress was white, but her fate had already turned black. Get up, bride. We said the oven would be burning before the sun climbs the mountain, and you're still lost in dreams. Kader jolted awake. The old cardigan on her was damp from the cellar's cold moisture. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and the weight of her father's absence sat heavy in her chest. Hatis set down the bucket in her hand. Water splashed onto Kader's feet. Look at her, still staring at those henna'd hands. Those hands aren't for weddings anymore. They're for work now. Go on. Get to the yard. Chop the wood. Light the oven. If there's no fresh bread for breakfast, don't expect to face Sihan. Kader slowly pushed herself up on trembling legs. Mother, she said quietly, her voice barely there. Is he awake? I just wanted to see him, to say good morning. Hatis's face darkened instantly. She stepped closer, her eyes sharp. My husband, is it? What husband? Are you married to him? You think you're the lady of this house? Her voice dropped, cold and cutting. You're nothing but someone we took in. Jihan is my son. He's resting. You earn your place before you even think about stepping near him. Now move. Kader lowered her head and stepped outside. The cold air cut across her face like a blade. The axe felt heavy in her hands, her fingers too delicate for it. With every strike, the fresh henna on her palms cracked and faded, and she remembered her father's rough, calloused hands. Be patient, Kader, she whispered to herself. This is a test. If you endure, God will open a door. By the time the sun reached its peak, the table was set. Tsihan came down the stairs, weariness weighing on his shoulders. His eyes drifted to the yard, to Kader, her face smudged with soot, still working. Something tightened inside him. The girl in the red veil from yesterday was gone. What stood there now was only a shadow. He was about to step toward her, but Hatis grabbed his arm. Son, come sit. Your bride woke up early for you, made the bread with her own hands. But don't give her attention. Her father just died. If she gets comfortable, we won't be able to control her. You are the master here. She is the one who serves. Remember that. Jihan sat down. When Kader entered with a bowl of olives, her heart raced. She longed just to meet his eyes, but Jihan kept his gaze lowered, as if she weren't even there, like she was just another object in the room. My husband. The bread is warm, Kader said softly, her voice trembling with hope. Tsihan was about to say, "Thank you," but Hatis cut in immediately. "You didn't put enough salt in it. If you can't do it right, I will. Go to the barn, clean it out, and don't come back before you milk the cows." Kader's throat tightened. She waited. Just one word from him. Just one. "Enough, Mother. She just got here." But Tsihan simply took a sip of his tea and looked out the window. And in that moment, Kader understood. The man she thought would be her shelter couldn't even stand on his own. When she stepped into the barn, the sharp smell burned her throat. She dropped to her knees and broke down, sobbing into the silence. "Father," she whispered into the dark, "who did you leave me with? Your grave is still fresh, and my pain is darker than it." Just then, the barn door creaked open. It was Tsihan. He held a small piece of cheese and a slice of bread. He glanced around quickly, then handed them to her. "Here, eat this. Don't let my mother see. Don't be upset, Kader. Give it some time. We'll get married. Things will settle. My mother is just like this. She's harsh, but she doesn't mean harm." Kader didn't look at the bread. She looked into his eyes, at that weak, hesitant kindness. "My husband," she said through tears. "Marriage is just a few words, isn't it? Why do you deny it to me? Why do you keep me here like I don't belong?" Tsihan hesitated, about to speak. But Hatis's voice thundered from outside. "Tsihan, where are you? Come look at these accounts." He quickly dropped the bread into Kader's lap and rushed out of the barn. Kader looked down at it. The bread was cold, just like his love. Her stomach was empty, but her soul was starving even more. That night, Hatis's voice echoed again at the cellar door. "Bride, tomorrow is market day. You'll prepare the sacks, and if anything is missing, don't expect me to say a single prayer for your father's soul." Kader looked at her hands in the darkness. The henna was completely gone now, replaced by soot and dirt. When she closed her eyes, she heard her father's voice. "Patience is bitter, my daughter." But Kader's patience was beginning to hurt. The first chill of autumn had settled into the rooms of the house. Kader stood in the kitchen, sifting flour for dinner, when Hatis appeared at the cellar door. In her hand was the key to that modest wooden chest Kader had brought from her father's house. The moment Kader saw it, she wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron, her heart jumping into her throat. That chest didn't just hold a few belongings. Inside it was a silver necklace her father had crafted by hand, and a silk scarf passed down from her mother. "Mother," Kader said, her voice trembling. "That key, isn't that the key to my chest?" Hatis casually spun the key around her finger, as if it meant nothing. "Yes, it is. In this house, there are no locked doors, no hidden chests. Until you are properly married, you are under our care. So what's yours is ours. Besides, your father is gone. You have nothing left behind. Let's see if there's anything useful in there." Kader stepped forward in panic. "Please, don't. Those are my mother's memories. My father's last gifts. Don't touch them. I'm begging you." Hatis shoved her aside with a sharp push of her shoulder. "Move. You're just a child. You don't know how to take care of things. Tomorrow you'll lose them, or break them. I'll keep them safe in my own chest. You can have them when the time is right." Tears filling her eyes, Kader followed her into the room. Hatis threw open the chest without hesitation. She pulled out embroidered towels, delicate scarves, tossing them carelessly onto the floor. Then she found the small velvet box at the bottom. When she opened it, the silver necklace caught the light and shimmered. Hatis's eyes lit up. She grabbed it immediately and tucked it into her waistband. At that moment, Kater noticed the folded note her father had written to her lying in the corner of the chest. Hatis crumpled it and tossed it aside without a second thought. "What would you even do with silver and silk?" she said coldly. "You're a worker in this house now. These will stay in my chest. Now go. Set the table before the men come back from the fields." Kater dropped to her knees. She stared at the scattered pieces of her past, at the memory of her father's labor, now trampled underfoot. Just then, Sihan walked in. He paused when he saw the room, the mess, the scarves on the floor, Kater sobbing. "What's going on here? Mother, what is this?" Kater rushed to him, grabbing onto his clothes, hope flooding her voice. "Please, say something. She opened my chest. She took my father's things. She says she'll keep them safe. But I know she won't give them back. They were all I had left. Please, stop her." Sihan looked at his mother. Hatis stepped toward him, her voice soft but laced with poison. "My son, am I doing anything wrong? I'm protecting the girl. What if she loses these things? What if something happens? I'm keeping them safe for the honor of this family. You know she's still just a child. She doesn't understand the value of what she has." Sihan met her gaze. Then he looked at Kader, her tear-filled eyes pleading with him. For a brief moment, something stirred inside him, but his fear won. He placed a hand on Kater's shoulder, not to protect her, but to quiet her. "Kater, my mother is right. She knows better than us. It doesn't matter. It's all the same in the end. Her chest. Our chest. Don't upset yourself. Go back to the kitchen. Let's not disturb the peace." Kater's hands slowly slipped away from him, and in that moment, she understood. Sihan wasn't just his mother's son. He was a part of her. His kindness only existed where his mother allowed it. That evening, not a single bite passed Kater's lips. Hatis ate with appetite, as if nothing had happened, all the while giving orders without pause. Kater stood by the kitchen window, staring into the dark sky. Her father's grave was on the other side of the village, but she felt farther from him than ever before. That night, as she lay in the cellar, she pulled out the crumpled note her father had written. It said only this: "My daughter Kader, stand tall like your name. No matter how hard the wind blows, your patience is your ground." Kader pressed the note against her chest. "Father," she whispered, "I've become the ground, and they're trampling over me, but my patience isn't gone. It's just buried deeper." Kader didn't know yet that Hatis's greed wouldn't stop at gold. It would soon reach for her dignity and her very womanhood. The days had grown shorter, and the early evenings, settling over the barren land, only deepened Kader's loneliness. One afternoon, Hatis gathered the neighborhood women in the yard. Inside, Kader was scrubbing laundry, but she could hear the low whispers rising from outside. Hatis tapped her coffee cup against the saucer as she spoke, her voice carrying just enough. "Oh, neighbors, if only you knew what I'm dealing with. We brought a bride into this house, and ever since, nothing has gone right. It's like her father's misfortune followed her here. Our blessings have dried up. Every time she steps into the kitchen, something goes missing. Just the other day, I noticed my gold had been moved. I'm not saying she steals, but her eyes are always on what isn't hers. She's already trying to get into Tihan's head, pushing for marriage. But I know the truth. Once she gets that marriage, she'll throw us out of our own home. Kader squeezed the wet laundry in her hands until her knuckles turned white. Lies. She wanted to shout it, but the words died in her throat. She knew if she spoke, Hatis would only twist it further. "See?" she would say. "Now she's disrespecting her elders too." By the time evening came and Tihan returned from the fields, the air in the house felt heavier than ever. Hatis met him at the door, her face painted with false sorrow, her eyes hiding something darker. "My son," she began softly, "something very serious happened today. I can barely even say it. I saw Kader in your room, taking your father's silver watch. When I asked her, she said she wanted to keep it as a memory. But I'm worried. This girl will never be satisfied. One day, she'll try to take everything. She might even turn you against me, or worse." Tihan frowned. That watch, his father's watch, was the most precious thing he owned. "Mother, are you sure? Kader wouldn't do something like that. I trust her." "Don't trust her," Hatis snapped quietly. "Women can be cunning, and a girl with no one left is even more dangerous. Go check under your pillow. That's where she hid it." Without another word, Tihan stormed toward the cellar. Kader was in the corner, exhausted, clutching her father's note to her chest. Before she could react, Tihan grabbed her by the arm and shook her. "Where is it, Kader? Where is my father's watch?" She stared at him, confused and frightened. "What watch? I've never even been in your room. Your mother forbade me." Tihan didn't listen. He tore apart her thin bedding, flipping everything over. And then the silver pocket watch fell out from inside the pillow. It hit the stone floor with a sharp, hollow sound. Tihan froze, and in that moment, Kader's world shattered for the second time. "I swear, I didn't put it there. Your mother is lying. I've never even seen that watch." Tihan picked it up and slipped it into his pocket. His face hardened, disappointment and anger blending together. "That's enough, Kader. My mother was right. The more I showed you kindness, the more you betrayed me behind my back. You kept talking about marriage. After this, don't expect it from me. In this house, you're nothing but someone we took in. You'll work for your food, and that's all. Don't let me see you anywhere near my room again." He slammed the door and walked out. "Tihan!" Kader cried, but her voice echoed off the walls and came back to her, unanswered. Outside, Hatis's voice rose, filled with triumph. "You see, my son? Didn't I tell you?" That night, a storm broke. The sky seemed to scream with Kader's pain. In the darkness, she looked at her hands. The henna was gone, her skin cracked and worn, but the deepest wound was in her heart. The man she loved had looked at her like she was a thief. The next morning, Hatis sent her to the well in the yard. "Go," she said coldly. "Wash those sinful hands. Today is laundry day. You won't leave that basin until evening. And don't expect any food. Maybe hunger will teach you discipline." Kader stood by the freezing water, scrubbing clothes. For a moment, she stopped at the edge of the well and looked down into its dark depth. If I let myself fall, it would all end. Just then, she felt the crumpled note in her pocket. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Your patience is your ground, my daughter." Kader straightened. She wiped her tears. "I won't die," she whispered to herself. "Not until I clear my name. Not until this dhulm ends. But Kader didn't know. Hatice's cruelty had only just begun. Winter was coming, and Kader would soon pay the price of being alone, unmarried, and stripped of her dignity in the cold. While Hatice sat comfortably by the stove, sipping her coffee in the warmth of the house, she had no hesitation sending Kader out into the freezing cold, back to the well. A girl without marriage has no rightful place, she would say. Work, so at least what you eat becomes lawful. Every day she found a new task. The old cardigan on Kader's back was now full of holes, and her worn shoes had started to soak through with water. One morning, when Kader woke up, she felt a heavy lump in her throat and a burning deep in her chest. Her head spun. Her bones ached as if they were grinding against each other. With what little strength she had, she pushed open the cellar door and stepped into the kitchen. Hatice had already set the table, serving Sihan warm milk with honey. "Mother," Kader said, her voice strained and weak. "My head is spinning. I feel like I'm going to collapse. Please, let me lie down for a while today." Hatice slammed her spoon against the plate. "Would you look at that? The lady thinks she's delicate now. The moment snow falls, she suddenly gets sick so she can lie around. You see this, Chihan? We feed her, and she plays games with us. Get up, the wood in the yard is buried under snow. Go dig it out and carry it to the barn. The animals are freezing, and I don't have time for your excuses." Chihan looked at Kader's pale face, her lips turning blue. Something stirred inside him. He almost reached out to touch her forehead, but when he caught his mother's sharp, warning glance, he pulled his hand back. "Kader, just try a little," he said, guilt in his voice. "My mother is right. Work can't wait. I'll bring you medicine from town tonight." Kader answered him with a single tear. She stepped outside. The snow was up to her knees. She began digging out the wood with her bare hands, scraping through the frozen layers. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore. Every breath stabbed her lungs like needles. At one point, her vision blurred. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the pile of wood. No one knew how long she lay there. When she finally came to, snowflakes hitting her face. Night had already fallen. She dragged herself toward the door, but it was locked. From inside, Hatice's voice called out, "You're not coming in until the wood is done. Don't bring your misfortune into this house." That night, Kader stayed in the barn, trying to keep warm with the animal's breath. Curled into the hay, she drifted into a dream. She saw her father. He was holding a white horse. "Come, my daughter," he said. "Get on. Let's leave this place." Just as she reached out her hand, "Kader!" She woke up to Tsihan's voice. It was morning. Tsihan stood at the barn door, and when he saw Kader's body, stiff and nearly frozen, something inside him snapped for the first time. "Mother, what have you done? Are you trying to kill her?" He rushed forward, lifting Kader into his arms and carrying her inside. She was burning with fever, barely conscious, murmuring to herself. Hatice, meanwhile, acted as if nothing had happened. "You're overreacting," she said. "She just caught a little cold. She's a village girl. She won't die." Tsihan laid Kader down on her thin bed in the cellar. When he touched her forehead, the heat shocked him. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, Kader grabbed his hand weakly and whispered, "My husband. The watch. I didn't take it. Your mother. My chest." Tsihan froze. In that fragile moment, her truth shattered every doubt inside him. He stood up and walked straight to his mother's room. Hatis was standing in front of the mirror, holding the silver necklace against her neck. When Cihan burst through the door, she tried to hide it, but it was too late. He had seen it. That necklace was Kader's father's. "Mother," Cihan said, his voice trembling for the first time, not with fear, but with anger. "What have you done? You called her a thief, and you're wearing her father's memory around your neck. You left her outside to die. Where is your conscience?" Hatis, cornered, grew even harsher. "Enough. Everything I did for you. That girl was never your equal. She was nothing but someone we took in." For the first time in his life, Cihan looked directly into his mother's eyes and shouted, "She's not a burden. She was supposed to be my wife, and you sacrificed her." He turned and rushed back to Kader, but Kader had already slipped deeper into unconsciousness. Cihan mounted his horse, desperate to bring a doctor from town, but the roads were closed. The storm had swallowed everything. Helpless, he returned and fell to his knees beside her. "Kader, wake up. I promise. We'll get married. Everything will change." But Kader couldn't hear him. At that moment, a deep cold filled the room. Her breathing slowed, and in the kitchen, Hatis calmly stirred the evening soup, as if nothing was happening. Kader's patience was now being tested with her life. Cihan took Kader's frozen hands into his own. Those hands, once decorated with henna, were now cracked from labor, bruised by cold, their life completely drained. He lowered his head onto her chest and broke down. "Wake up, Kader, please, wake up. I was the one who failed, not you. I listened to my mother. I thought you had no one. But it turns out, the one without anyone is my own conscience." Just then, the door creaked open. Hatis stepped inside, holding a small bowl of burning incense. Her face still carried that same rigid pride, that same unshaken arrogance. "Leave her, Cihan. If she's meant to die, she'll die. It's God's will," she said coldly. "The house feels heavy because of her. I'm burning incense to drive away the darkness. Go outside. A man doesn't sit and cry at a woman's bedside, especially not one he hasn't even married." Cihan shot to his feet like a spring snapping loose. His eyes burned with fury. He stepped toward his mother so suddenly that, for the first time, Hatis took a step back. "Enough, mother. Enough. This isn't fate. This is you. You buried this girl alive with your own hands. This house didn't need incense. It needed mercy. And you threw that out long ago. If she dies tonight, know this. I won't walk out of this house as your son, but as your executioner." Hatis froze. "Cihan, what are you saying? I am your mother." "You are my mother, but you've also become my ruin. Now get out of this room. Go bring everything you took from her, the silver, the memories you stole. Put them beside her. Maybe, just maybe, she'll feel them and come back." Hatis left the room in anger, but this time there was fear behind it. Cihan stayed by Kader's side all night. He melted snow to wipe her body, tried to make her drink herbal tea, did everything he could to keep her alive. And just before dawn, when all hope seemed gone, Kader's eyes fluttered open. She looked at Cihan, but she didn't recognize him. Her gaze was distant, as if her soul was still buried beneath that pile of snow outside. "Father," she whispered, her voice barely stronger than a breath. "I'm cold. Bring me my wedding dress. I'm cold." Cihan broke down, pressing her hand to his lips. I'll bring it, Kader. The most beautiful one, the purest white. We'll get married. Everything will change. This cellar will end. This suffering will end. Slowly, Kader turned her head. Her eyes landed on Hatis. Hatis stood by the doorway, holding the silver necklace and the silk scarf. She had brought them because Tihan forced her to, but there was still no apology on her face. Kader looked at the necklace, then at Hatis, and in that moment, something inside her broke. The quiet, obedient Kader, the one who endured everything, died right there. The softness in her eyes hardened into something cold, something unbreakable. I don't want them, Kader said. Her voice was no longer weak. It was calm, firm. I don't want them, Mother. Keep the silver. It suits you better. It's no longer mine. She turned her eyes toward Sihan. And don't cry for me. If you want me to live, don't marry me. I didn't come to this house to be a wife. I came here to die. Let me die so you can be free of my misfortune. Sihan collapsed inside. Her quiet rejection hurt more than every cruel word his mother had ever spoken. Don't say that, Kader. You'll recover. Everything will change. Kader slowly closed her eyes. It won't, she whispered. The snow melts, but the mud beneath it stays. You are your mother's son, and I am my father's daughter. Between us, it's not mountains of snow. It's your silence. That day, the roads finally opened. A doctor came from town. Medicine was given. Slowly, Kader began to recover. But she never smiled again. She moved through the house like a ghost. She didn't resist Hatis anymore, but she never looked at her either. And Hatis, seeing that her son's old respect for her was gone, sharpened her hatred toward Kader even more. Kader no longer lived in that house as someone taken in. She lived there as a stranger, and that spring, her life would bring something else. A miracle, and with it, another burden. Kader was pregnant, unmarried, unprotected, and carrying a life beneath a roof that had already turned against her. The moment Kader realized she was pregnant, the first thing she did was hide it. She knew Hatis wouldn't see it as a blessing, but as a weapon. She tightened her waistband, tried to conceal the gentle swell beneath her loose clothes. But Hatis's eyes were sharp, like a hawk's. She had already noticed the signs. Kader's morning nausea, her pale face, her loss of appetite. One afternoon, while Sihan was out in the fields, Hatis stormed into the kitchen. Kader was placing bread into the oven. Hatis grabbed her by the shoulders and slammed her back against the wall. Her hand pressed hard against Kader's stomach. What is this? What's this swelling? Kader's eyes widened in fear. Mother, please, don't. You're hurting me, she whispered. Hatisi stepped back slowly, like a commander who had just claimed victory. So that's it, she said. You came into my house without marriage, and now you carry a bastard in your belly? Whose child is it? My son's. Or did you bring this shame from your father's house? The words rang in Kader's ears. Mother, listen to yourself, she cried. I belong to Tihan. My heart has never known anyone else. This child is his blood, his life. Hatis burst into laughter, cold, merciless. Oh, spare me. You have no marriage, no proof. What am I supposed to tell people? That my son slept with a girl without marrying her? No. I'll say this. You came into this house already stained. We took you in out of pity, and you deceived us. I'll make Shihan believe it too. Let's see if that husband you trust so much will even look at your face then." That evening, when Shihan returned home, Hatis was already in the yard, crying, beating her chest, putting on a performance. Shihan rushed to her side. "Mother, what happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm not hurt, my son." "Your honor is—" she cried. "Look at your bride. Her belly is already showing. She tricked us, Shihan. She came here carrying this burden. I confronted her. She confessed. She said she'd pin it on you, force you into marriage, and take everything." Shihan felt his mind go numb. He turned toward the kitchen door. Kater stood there, eyes full of tears, hands resting over her stomach. He didn't know what to believe anymore. "Kater," he said slowly, "is it true? What my mother is saying?" Kater stepped toward him, desperate. "Shihan, please, don't believe her. This is your child. I came from my father's home pure. I came to you. I haven't stepped outside this house for months. You know that." Hatis cut in immediately. "She's lying. People saw her talking to that shepherd at the market. I kept quiet, thinking of the home, but no more. That child will not be born under this roof." Shihan fell into his mother's trap once again. The seed of doubt planted in him began to eat away at everything he felt for Kater. "So that's why you kept asking for marriage?" he said bitterly. "Because you needed a father for what you're carrying?" Kater staggered back. It felt like something inside her had shattered completely. "Shihan, you too?" she whispered. "You believe this about me too?" "Get out!" Shihan shouted. "Go wherever you want. But you can't stay here like this, under my mother's roof with this shame." Hatis smirked. "No, son. If we throw her out, people will talk. Let her stay. Let her suffer. She can sleep in the barn, clean after the animals. Not a bite of food until she gives birth. And when she does, she can take that bastard and go wherever she pleases." That night, Kater was exiled to the barn. With nothing but her thin cardigan, she sank into the hay, one hand over her stomach. "Don't be afraid," she whispered through her tears. "Your father rejected you. Your grandmother called you a bastard. But your mother is here. I won't leave you alone in this darkness." From that day on, Kater refused to eat or drink anything given by Hatis. She survived on wild herbs she gathered from the hills, and water she secretly drew from the well. Shihan, meanwhile, was breaking apart inside. He couldn't bear to see her in the barn, yet he couldn't escape his mother's poisonous words. The trial was no longer just hers. It had become about the life growing inside her. And as the heat of summer approached, and Kater's time drew near, Hatis was already preparing her final move. But there was one thing she failed to understand. The cry of the oppressed is never left unheard. Harvest season had come, and the men of the village were scattered across the fields. Shihan worked under the burning sun, his mind still tangled in doubt. That day, Kater's pain began, stronger and more relentless than the heat outside. In the damp corner of the barn, she curled into herself on the hay. Sweat poured from her forehead, mixing with her tears as they soaked into the dirt. "Mother," she cried out weakly, her voice lost among the sounds of the animals. "Hatis, please, help me. The baby is coming." Hatis sat outside in the yard, casually cracking seeds, pretending not to hear. Inside her mind, a darker thought passed. If she dies, I'll be rid of both her and that child. At one point, she walked up to the barn door and glanced inside, her eyes cold. "Stop shouting," she said. "That child doesn't belong to this house. Go give birth wherever you got it from. And if you dare call a midwife, I'll tell everyone your shame. You won't be able to show your face outside. Handle it yourself." She slammed the door shut and locked it from the outside. In that moment, Kader understood. It was just her baby, and God. She dropped to her knees. "My Lord," she whispered through sobs, "just as you helped Mary in the wilderness, help me now. Don't let my child fall into the hands of cruelty." The pain grew stronger, wave after wave. Kader felt like she would lose consciousness. She bit down on a piece of wood, swallowing her screams. And as the afternoon call to prayer echoed, a thin, powerful cry filled the dark, dusty air of the barn. With the last of her strength, Kader lifted her newborn into her arms. A boy. He looked just like his father, his features, his eyes, even the small mark on his forehead. Kader wrapped him in a clean cloth and held him close to her chest. In that moment, all her pain, all her sorrow, fell silent. "Welcome," she whispered softly. "You are your father's trust." The baby's scent seemed to push away the heavy smell of the barn. That evening, when Tsihan returned home, exhausted, he heard the sound of crying coming from the barn. His heart dropped. Ignoring his mother's sharp voice, "Don't go there!" He ran to the door and tore it open. What he saw inside changed his life in an instant. Kader sat on the hay, holding a newborn in her arms. Tsihan stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the baby's face. And in that moment, every shadow of doubt vanished. It was like looking at his own reflection as a child. This is mine," he whispered, his voice breaking. "This child is a part of me. What have I done? How did I believe those lies?" He fell to his knees in front of Kader and the baby, sobbing uncontrollably. Kader said nothing. There was no anger in her eyes, no joy either, only a deep, endless exhaustion. Hatis stormed inside. "Why are you crying, Tsihan? Take that bastard and throw him out. Are you trying to disgrace us in front of the village?" Tsihan stood up. In that moment, he seemed taller than his mother. "Enough!" he shouted. "If you ever call this child that again, forget you have a son. Look at him. Look at what you've done. He's my child, my blood. You even put that shame on your own grandson." Without another word, Tsihan lifted Kader and the baby in his arms and carried them upstairs, into his own room, onto his own bed. Hatis stood frozen at the doorway. That night, Tsihan stayed by Kader's side, but Kader, holding her baby close like a shield, didn't say a single word to him. The next day, while Kader slept, Hatis tried to take the baby, planning to leave him in the courtyard of the mosque. But as she stepped forward, her foot caught on the threshold. She fell, down the stairs, hard. The silence of the village shattered with her scream. When Tsihan and the others rushed to her, she lay on the ground, motionless. Her lower body wouldn't move. Only broken, meaningless sounds came from her mouth. Divine justice had begun, with the cry of a child born in a barn. Now Hatis was left helpless, in the hands of the very girl she had once condemned to that same place. The atmosphere inside the house changed overnight. Tsihan found himself torn between his newborn son and his bedridden mother, but the heaviest burden still rested on Kader's shoulders. Jihan couldn't even bring himself to enter his mother's room. He avoided her gaze, that one dimmed eye filled with something between hatred and regret. Hatis lay there, helpless. She needed to be fed, cleaned, cared for. One morning, Jihan stood at her door with a bowl of soup in his hands. But he couldn't step inside. His hands trembled. Just then, Kader came up behind him, the baby in her arms, clean cloths over her shoulder. "Give it to me," she said calmly. "You go take care of your work. She is still an entrusted soul. I'll take care of her." Jihan turned, stunned. "Kader, don't. This woman sent you to the barn. She called our child a bastard. She stole your father's memory. How can you even touch her now? Let her face what she deserves." Kader looked straight into his eyes. "She saw me fit for the barn, but God gave me this home and this child. I won't become like her, Jihan. If I answer cruelty with cruelty, then what makes me any different?" Her voice softened. "My father told me, defeat evil with goodness. I am my father's daughter, not Hatis's reflection." Kader stepped inside. The room smelled of medicine and sweat. Hatis saw her and slowly closed her eyes. Whether from shame or from the remnants of her pride, no one could tell. Kader laid the baby gently at the side of the bed. "Look, mother," she said softly. "Your grandson is here. We named him Yusuf, so he may rise from the well to a place of honor. You were our well, but we became Yusuf." She took Hatis's hand, once strong, now frail and lifeless. With a warm cloth, she wiped her face, gently combed her hair. A single tear rolled down from Hatis's one functioning eye. Falling onto the pillow, she couldn't speak. But that tear said everything. "Forgive me." Kader dipped the spoon into the soup, blew on it gently, and brought it to her lips. "Drink, mother. It will heal you. You once gave me bitter soup. I made you sweet soup. Drink so we can make peace." Days turned into weeks. Kader cared for her baby and for her mother-in-law, like she was caring for another child. And Jihan, with every passing day, felt smaller in the face of his wife's strength. One evening, he walked into the kitchen holding a piece of paper. His eyes were shining. "Kader," he said, his voice trembling. "Tomorrow we're going to town. I've arranged everything. The witnesses are ready. The imam is waiting. We'll finally be married. No one will ever call you an outsider again. You are the lady of this house. The keys, the chest, everything is yours now." Kader lifted her gaze. "My husband," she said quietly, "marriage isn't written on paper. It's written in the heart. I waited for that paper when my father was still alive, when my henna was still fresh. Now I am Yusuf's mother, the pillar of this house." She paused. "We'll have the ceremony, but know this, my true bond was written with patience." That night, a strained sound came from Hatis's room. Jihan and Kader rushed in. Hatis's breathing had grown shallow, her hands reaching into the air, searching for something. Kader dropped to her side, holding her hand. With her last strength, Hatis squeezed Kader's hand, then pointed weakly beneath her pillow. Jihan lifted it. Underneath were the gold pieces, the silver watch, and the crumpled note. Everything she had taken. Hatis looked into Kader's eyes. In that look, there was a lifetime of regret. Kader leaned forward and kissed her forehead. "It's forgiven, mother," she whispered. "I forgive you. Go in peace. Yusuf and I will pray for you." That night, Hatis closed her eyes, peacefully, and the heavy darkness that had hung over that house lifted at last, through a mother's final regret and a daughter-in-law's endless mercy. After the funeral, the house woke to a morning unlike any before, quieter than ever, yet more peaceful than it had ever been. Tsihan had risen early. For the first time in months, he lit the stove with his own hands. When Kader stepped into the kitchen, she saw him holding the key to that old wooden chest. He walked over and placed it gently on the table in front of her. "Kader," he said. This time his voice didn't tremble. It was steady, grounded. "This key isn't just for that chest. It's the key to this house, this home, and to my heart. My mother is gone. She returned to the earth with all her sins and all her good. But you put out fire with water in this house. From now on, you are its lady and its keeper. Tomorrow we go to town. I will stand beside you as your rightful husband and as Yusuf's father." Kader took the key into her hand. The cold metal pressed against her palm, but she smiled. "My husband," she said softly. "Paper can seal a marriage, but the real bond lives in the heart. I waited for that paper when my father was still alive, when the henna on my hands was still fresh. Now I am Yusuf's mother, the pillar of this home." She looked at him gently. "We'll have the ceremony, but my true bond was written in patience long ago." That day in town, they were married. Kader wore the silver necklace her father had left her and wrapped her white scarf around her head. As she walked beside Tsihan through the narrow streets, no one looked at her with pity, or suspicion, or judgment. She was no longer the girl they had whispered about. She was a woman who had endured, who had remained silent when accused, and who had cleansed every lie with dignity. Years passed like water. Yusuf grew into a young man, honest like his grandfather Sefer, strong like his father Tsihan, and compassionate like his mother. The house no longer echoed with cries, but with laughter. One holiday morning, Kader called Yusuf to her side. She opened her chest. From the very bottom she took out the old dress, the one she had worn that first night. It still carried the faint scent of the barn, traces of hay, and the faded marks of henna. Yusuf looked at it, confused. "Mother, why do you keep this old, worn-out dress? Your wardrobe is full of fine things." Kader touched the faded stain of henna. "This dress is my witness," she said, her eyes distant. "People may throw stones at you. They may try to push you down. They may call you names, say you are nothing, that you don't belong. But remember this, no one can stand in the way of what God has written." She paused. "I slept in a barn wearing this dress, but I woke up in a palace with this heart. Never break someone's heart. Never take the prayer of the oppressed lightly, because the cry of the oppressed rises slowly. But when it does, it shakes everything." Yusuf leaned down and kissed his mother's hand. Kader looked out the window. The quince tree in the yard was heavy with fruit. Tsihan stood outside, laughing with his grandchildren. Kader took a deep breath. The test had been hard. The winter had been cruel. But spring had come. And as our story ends, one truth remains. Some carry wood to feed the fire of cruelty. Others carry water and bring peace. May we be among those who carry water, those who endure, and those who, in the end, always rise.